Right now, somewhere in your house, there's a book you'll never read. Maybe it's on a shelf. Maybe it's in a box you haven't opened since you moved. It doesn't feel like a tragedy, it's just a book. But 2,000 years ago, in a single afternoon, the world lost somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 of them. And historians still argue about whether that loss set human progress back by an entire millennium. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria. Not the myth. Not the dramatic version where Julius Caesar burns it down in one cinematic blaze. The real story is slower, stranger, and far more unsettling. Because the real story isn't about a fire. It's about what happens to a civilization when it stops protecting the thing that made it great in the first place. Let's go back to the beginning. Around 300 BCE, a Macedonian general named Ptolemy I Soter inherited a fractured piece of Alexander the Great's empire. He took control of Egypt. But Ptolemy didn't just want land. He wanted something rarer. He wanted to build the single greatest concentration of human knowledge the world had ever seen. So he built a library. Not a quiet room with a few scrolls. A research institution. A place historians now compare to a combination of Harvard, MIT, and the Library of Congress, except all of it existed 14 centuries before any of those institutions were founded. At its peak, the Library of Alexandria is estimated to have held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Think about what that means in an age before printing presses. Every single one of those scrolls had to be copied by hand. Every one represented months, sometimes years, of human labor. And the Ptolemies didn't just collect books. They hunted them down. Ships that docked in the harbor of Alexandria were legally required to hand over any scrolls on board to be copied. The library kept the copy. The original sometimes went back to the owner. Sometimes it didn't. This wasn't just a library. It was an obsession. Why would a kingdom build its entire identity around scrolls? Because Ptolemy understood something that most rulers in history have missed. Knowledge wasn't just prestige, it was power. A kingdom that understood astronomy could navigate better. A kingdom that understood medicine could keep its armies alive. A kingdom that understood mathematics could engineer things its neighbors couldn't even imagine. So Alexandria became a magnet. Scholars came from Athens, from Persia, from India, from across the Mediterranean world. And what they built there still echoes through your life today, whether you've ever heard their names or not. Eratosthenes worked at the library. Using nothing but shadows, a stick, and basic geometry, he calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a few % of its actual size. He did this over 2,000 years before satellites existed. Euclid taught there. His work on geometry became the foundation for mathematics for the next 2,000 years. If you ever sat through a geometry class and complained about proofs, you were complaining about Euclid's homework. Herophilus performed some of the earliest documented human dissections in history, mapping the nervous system and distinguishing arteries from veins. Modern historians of medicine consider some of his anatomical observations centuries ahead of what came after him, because the knowledge that followed Alexandria's collapse often had to be rediscovered from scratch. Do you see the pattern forming yet? This wasn't a random collection of smart people. It was a system. A machine built specifically to concentrate human intelligence in one place and let it compound. Scholars debated each other. They corrected each other. They built on each other's work in real time, the same way a modern research university does. Except this was happening before the Roman Empire had even fully formed. And then, slowly, the machine started breaking. Here's where the myth and the history split apart. You've probably heard that Julius Caesar burned the library to the ground in 48 BCE. That part is partially true. During a conflict in the Alexandrian harbor, Caesar's forces set fire to ships docked nearby, and the flames likely spread to warehouses near the waterfront. Some ancient sources suggest scrolls were lost in that fire. But the library itself, the actual institution, kept functioning for centuries afterward. So what actually destroyed it? Not one fire. A slow bleed. Funding dried up under later rulers who didn't share Ptolemy's obsession. Scholars left as political stability collapsed. Rome eventually absorbed Egypt, and the empire's priorities shifted away from funding open-ended research with no immediate payoff. By the 3rd and 4th century CE, The library that once attracted the greatest minds in the ancient world had been hollowed out by neglect, by funding cuts, by the kind of quiet institutional decay that doesn't make for dramatic movie scenes but is, historically speaking, far more common. The final blow likely came in 391 CE, when a religious and political conflict led to the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple that by then housed what remained of the library's collection. By then, though, most of the original knowledge base had probably already vanished. Not in flames, in budget meetings, in administrative neglect, in scholars packing up and leaving because nobody was paying them to stay. Here's the question that keeps historians up at night. What did we actually lose? We don't fully know. That's the unsettling part. We only know about the scholars and discoveries that happen to be mentioned in surviving texts written by other people centuries later. For every Eratosthenes we know about, there could have been a dozen scholars whose work simply vanished, unrecorded, uncopied, unremembered. Some historians, including Carl Sagan in his work popularizing the history of science, argued that the loss of Alexandria's collective knowledge may have delayed major scientific advances by hundreds of years. Sagan pointed out that some ancient texts hinted at heliocentric models of the solar system, atomic theories of matter, and advanced engineering concepts that wouldn't reappear in European thought until the Renaissance, over 1,000 years later. Other historians pushed back on this. They argue it romanticizes the ancient world and ignores how much knowledge survived through Byzantine, Islamic, and other scholarly traditions that preserved and expanded on Greek learning for centuries after Alexandria declined. Islamic scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, for example, translated and built on Greek scientific texts long after Alexandria's library had crumbled. So maybe the truth sits in between. Maybe nothing was lost in a single tragic instant. Maybe knowledge simply moves, like water finding a new channel, and what looks like a catastrophic loss from one angle looks like a slow migration from another. But here's what should actually unsettle you. The Library of Alexandria didn't fall because of one villain or one fire. It fell because a civilization stopped treating knowledge as worth protecting. Funding stopped. Attention shifted elsewhere. The scholars who carried centuries of accumulated thinking in their heads simply scattered, and there was no one institution left to catch what they knew before it disappeared with them. Does that sound familiar? Think about how much human knowledge today lives in formats that are quietly decaying right now. Old websites disappearing. Software that can no longer open files from 20 years ago. Research papers behind paywalls that nobody can access. Institutions that lose funding overnight, scattering decades of specialized expertise into early retirement and career changes, with no one left to carry the work forward. You assume knowledge is permanent because it exists right now, on a screen, in a database, in someone's expertise. But permanence has never been the default state of human knowledge. Permanence is something a civilization has to actively choose, every single year, through funding, through attention, through the unglamorous work of maintaining what already exists instead of only chasing what's new. Alexandria didn't lose 1,000 years of science in one afternoon. It lost it over decades, through 1,000 small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. Cut this program. Reassign that scholar. Deprioritize that research. None of those decisions felt like burning a library, but together they were. So the next time you walk past a library that feels a little underfunded, a research department getting quietly defunded, or an archive nobody's bothered to digitize, remember Alexandria. The fire wasn't the tragedy. The neglect before the fire was. And somewhere in your house, there's still a book you'll never read. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it's not the books we forget that matter most. Maybe it's the ones we never even notice we've already lost.